Welcome to the Bible in a Year podcast, a resource from Enter the Bible. Journey with us through the books of the Bible, discovering more about Scripture and how it shapes our lives today. I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker.
And I'm Katie Langston.
And today we're joined by an old friend, Dr. Michael Chan. Michael Chan is the Vice President for Mission and Inclusion at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. He's also an Old Testament scholar. Before this position, he was a professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary. And he's also the host of the Gospel Beautiful podcast. So welcome, Michael. Good to see you again.
Great to see all of you. Thanks for the invitation. I'm so excited.
And this episode is on the book of Isaiah.
A huge one. Lots to cover.
A big book.
A big book with a lot of influence over the years. So, of course, I'm going to start with an absolutely impossible question, Michael, which is give us a quick summary or outline of this book.
Of all 66 chapters.
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. Just, rattle them off in a second or two.
I think maybe the best way to talk about it is to talk about when its historical setting and kind of when and how, why it was written. We have to kind of distinguish between the book of Isaiah and the prophet Isaiah. I think those are important distinctions. In some ways, you got to think about the book of Isaiah like a snowball. Maybe it starts off in the 8th century with this prophet, and he probably, the prophet Isaiah in the 8th century. He had some poems and oracles and things that he and probably others collected. And then over the years, those oracles and poems continued to resonate with people so much that they gathered more material, and that material got expanded and edited and collected, so that by the time the book concludes in around the 500s, say, maybe a little bit later, a couple hundred years after, but a couple hundred years after, you have a much larger snowball, and that is what we currently call the book of Isaiah. It is breathtaking in its scope and remarkable in some of its content. I would say it is, of all the this may be somewhat controversial, but of all the Old Testament books, it is likely one of the most significant books that we have. And I would say that is true both for Christianity and for Judaism.
I like that analogy of the snowball. That's a nice way of thinking about it.
We don't know anything about snowballs here in Fargo Moorhead. It's just an analogy that I've heard that there are people that live in I've heard there are people that live in snowy country, and so I just thought it might be helpful. I think it's true. I think it's a right analogy. Like it is, snowballs are never perfectly spherical. They have rough edges and they have, parts, there are divots that are out. It's just never a perfect sphere. Same with Isaiah. Like it didn't come down to us in this perfect spherical form. Like human fingerprints are all over it. And that is part of what makes it profound and also what makes it persistent, I think, over time.
Yeah. So, Michael, what would you say is a good way into this book?
I was thinking about Martin Luther, of course, lectured on the book of Isaiah and has quite a bit of material on it, which I'm grateful for. And he talks about how confusing the book is. It's like you start here and you're like, why are we over here? And suddenly they're shifting and we're talking about God and now we're talking about Ahaz or somebody else. What I would say is I do think it's helpful to read it from beginning to end, 1 through 66. It's not necessarily chronological in the way that a narrative would be laid out, but it is intentional in how it was designed. There are echoes on the front and the back end. There are themes that run throughout. And so I think it's smart to read it sort of cover to cover, as it were, but also slowly and patiently, and with a capable guide. And what I mean by that is we have wonderful study Bibles, like the Lutheran Study Bible on Isaiah is great. Both the old edition and the newest edition of that from 1517. But there are many other study Bibles. And so what I would say, read it sort of beginning to end, read it patiently, and read it with a guide. Because it's a hard book. And if you get frustrated and lost, then welcome to the book of Isaiah, because you're joining everybody else there.
I just read it just as part of my own, daily Bible reading, going from Genesis to Revelation. And yes, it was a challenge, but worthwhile one.
But it seems like around every corner, you're going to run into a passage that's familiar, right? Because there's just so many passages that have been significant in the life of the church.
It's so true. It's so true. And part of this is because what's the best way to say this? early Christianity, the sort of scriptural matrix of early Christianity was really the same scriptural matrix that was true for like Qumran, the Qumran community. And it's these three important books of Deuteronomy, Psalms, and Isaiah. Like these three books are so formative for early Christianity and also first century Judaism. But this is the reason why those three books are the most frequently cited or alluded to in the New Testament. And so that's exactly right, Kathryn. There's a reason why you just can't stop bumping into texts that you recognize, because the communities that, are nurtured by Isaiah just keep going back to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that leads nicely to sort of this next question, which is, what is the basic context for the book of Isaiah? Like, when was it written and who's the original audience? And I know there's like 3 Isaiahs, maybe. Am I making that up? Tell us.
It's definitely a cohort model, of writing. It was a group project, maybe put up. It was like a multi-generational group project. And
they did well, right? There was maybe the first Isaiah, was the one who did most of the work, but I don't know.
I think the best way to think about this is that there are three major historical horizons against which Isaiah was written. One is the 8th century. And with those three, let me back up and say, with those three horizons come 3 different empires whose power is exerted over ancient Judah in different kinds of ways. The first is the 8th century. This is the time of the prophet Isaiah. And that, in the Near East at that time, the Neo-Assyrian Empire sort of exerted the greatest amount of influence in different ways, in different places. But that is certainly important, and that's why you have the first 39 chapters are really structured in broad ways around King Ahaz and then also King Hezekiah and the siege of Sennacherib. And so that's the first horizon, is the horizon of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which falls in 609. The second major horizon is the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And this is the great kind of moment of exile that we often talk about, the Babylonian exile. And that is really the structural middle of the book. So if you read chapter 39 and then read chapter 40, you're like, something changed here. And everybody knows what changed there. And so they don't have to say it really too much out loud. What's changed there is the Babylonian exile itself. So you have and it came in multiple waves and all of that. But basically, Jerusalem is laid siege to. Its temple is destroyed. The royal house is effectively decimated and uprooted. And the kind of upper crust of society is deported to Mesopotamia with lower classes and basically like production classes, agricultural classes left behind in order to feed the empire through tribute. So that's kind of the major horizon. And then the third horizon, focused especially in chapters 56 through 66, is the Persian period. So the Neo-Babylonians are overthrown by the Persians. The Persians are an interesting empire based in what we would call modern-day Iran. And while they are certainly conquerors, they're also remembered as being a little bit more benevolent. And at least Cyrus the Great receives this remarkable title of being the Messiah, right, in these later chapters. And so those are kind of the 3 major historical horizons that the book is written against.
Okay. And we're thinking, I mean, when you say it's a group project, you said there was a guy in the 8th century named Isaiah. And then these other kind of periods are written like in his name. They're written in his, like, paying homage to him. Or tell us just a little bit about how that functions in this kind of literature.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that they didn't have intellectual property laws in the ancient world.
Exactly. Right. Different cultural context. They're
context.
not being shady.
No, they're not. No, this is normal. This is normal. And so the way authorship and composition worked in the ancient world is that you have a kind of upper class of scribes. And in this case, these would have been highly, highly educated because the poetry of Isaiah is exceptional. And Kathryn, this is an expertise area, Hebrew poetry for you. And so you'll know that also. And you have a core of material by this prophet Isaiah. Some of it might be oral, some of it might be written, but it gets built out by numerous and nameless scribes, literally over hundreds of years. We don't know who any of these people are. This isn't like Jeremiah where we have a scribe named like Baruch. This is Isaiah, and he's really the only one that we know is like sort of generating content. But at the end of the day, The stuff that gets added and edited after Isaiah's life is all pseudonymous, roughly speaking. So people are writing in Isaiah's name. It maintains sort of his voice, but they are adding to it, and that is totally normal in the ancient world.
Cool. Thanks.
All right. Well, we've come to our favorite part of the podcast, Bible Bingo. Yay. So for those who haven't been listening to this podcast before, this is the time when we have 5 concepts, words, people, places, historical context that would be on Michael's bingo card for reading the book of Isaiah. So we'll go through these in quick succession. So the first one you gave to us, Michael, is Hezekiah. Who's Hezekiah?
Yeah, so we can talk about Hezekiah both as like a literary figure and also as an historical figure. Hezekiah is a Judahite king. So he was a king in Jerusalem and part of, sort of David's lineage. To understand Hezekiah, you have to understand him in contrast to Ahaz. So Ahaz in the book of Isaiah is kind of understood to be the king who doesn't trust Yahweh, those kinds of things. Hezekiah, on the other hand, is the king who does. And so he survives the Assyrian siege of Sennacherib. This is in Isaiah 36 through 37, because of his trust both in Yahweh and also in Yahweh's prophet, Isaiah. So Hezekiah is a protagonist in the book of Isaiah. He is the king who trusts.
And we knew about Hezekiah, too, from 1st and 2nd Kings, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, so there's a lot of overlap between Isaiah and Kings, especially in the historical chapters. And so, yes, Hezekiah is also remembered as a mostly positive king in the book of Kings. And so alongside like David and Josiah, Hezekiah is right up there as one of these aren't like perfect people, but they are... Right. If you're grading on a curve, they're a little bit, they're B students, right? Not D students.
That's
good. I like
sometimes all we can ask for. B's get degrees, people.
So our second bingo concept is Assyria.
Okay. Assyria is an empire, nation, a people in northern Mesopotamia. And so if you think about modern day Iraq today, we're talking about the northern part of the country. Think about places like Mosul, which was near the ancient capital city of Nineveh. And so this is an ancient empire. They dominated, especially in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE when Isaiah, the prophet, the historical person, was operative.
Yeah, and they're the threat, right? Throughout the first part of the book of Isaiah.
That's right. They are interesting there. It's they are certainly a threat. There's no doubt about that. They are also, Yahweh kind of enlists them in doing things, especially acts of judgment. We see this like in Isaiah chapter 10. So yes, Assyria is the big dog on the block. To be sure, everybody is rightly afraid of them. And sometimes in ways that are interesting, Yahweh sort of partners with Assyria to bring judgment on the world and most especially on the nations, Israel and also the nations around it.
All right. So third term on the bingo card is restoration.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked earlier about the 3 horizons of the book. The second half of the book, 40 through 66, is really about homecoming and restoration, I would say, because the exile has happened. And so then the question is, what do we do? I mean, the exile is sort of societal collapse level disaster. Right. And then people are forced to ask the question like, well, what does this mean for us as like the covenant people? And the message that Isaiah brings is that there will one day be a homecoming and restoration. Like, I think it's important. The word salvation, of course, is used a lot in the book of Isaiah, but it's important that like when we read salvation, we cannot read like what North American Christianity thinks about that word. We have to understand that like when Isaiah says salvation, what he means is homecoming and restoration, the restoration of the nation, the restoration of the kingdom, the restoration of wealth, the restoration of glory and prestige in the nation. Like it is a national project, a people level project. And that's what he means by salvation. And so it's the restoring of the things that were lost, but also burnishing them quite a bit so that what comes after is greater than what existed prior.
Fourth term on the bingo card is Babylon.
Yeah, we got all these empires. So Babylon is the second empire. Now, if you think about Mesopotamia, again, Babylonians come from Mesopotamia. If Assyria is the northern kid on the block, Babylon is the southern kid on the block. South of the tracks is the people of Babylon. Now, as history often goes, one empire conquers another, and so the Assyrians were ruling, especially in the 8th century. They get overthrown at the end of the 7th century by the Babylonians, and you may remember names like Nebuchadnezzar or Merodach-Baladan. Names like this. And like their Assyrian counterparts, they're a polytheistic society, very, very powerful. And in order to kind of feed that imperial beast, they have to go out and conquer other people, extract their resources. And that is part of the reason why Babylon comes into contact with Judah, the southern kingdom of Judah.
And last term on the bingo card is judgment.
Oh, yes, this is good. All right, so... Well, the reason I chose judgment, right, is because as Lutherans, it's often one of the things that we're like, don't look over there.
That's so true.
Don't look over there. But you cannot read. But this is what I would say. It's a common assumption that, right, law and gospel is like what divides law and gospel is the testamental divide, and that's just flatly wrong. The book of Isaiah is a law and gospel book. And what I would say is that law and gospel, wrath, love, these are wrath and compassion. These are like two sides of the same coin. Like sometimes love looks like judgment, for sure. Sometimes love looks like grace and compassion. And so I just want us to, Terry Fretheim, our former colleague Terry Fretheim, was so good about lifting this up, especially in the first chapters of Isaiah, where you get this kind of parental language used there that shows that, like, also what connects love and judgment is anguish. The anguish of Yahweh, who is like, why are my children this way? Which, like, those of us who have kids ask that question all the time. Like, where do they come from?
Surely I had nothing to do with this.
Right. Exactly. So I want us to, as we read the book of Isaiah, you will encounter judgment. Try very hard not to dismiss it, but to read it as an expression of divine love. I think that's what Isaiah is going for. Now, you may disagree that, like, hey, that's not how I think a parent should love. That's fine. You can push back on that. But I think that is the intention of the book of Isaiah, is to see judgment as an expression of love.
Well, thank you, Michael. So that's the Bible bingo. The 5 terms again are Hezekiah, Assyria, restoration, Babylon, and judgment. So thank you for playing Bible bingo.
Yay.
Did we win? I guess.
You won.
Did we win?
You won. That's right.
What would you say, Michael, is weird or interesting about the book of Isaiah?
Oh, gosh.
Probably
I mean, I think there's so much that's weird. Yeah, there's so much interesting. I mean, it's not as weird as Ezekiel. Nothing is. Right. Nothing is. For me, it's an interesting book because, like I said earlier, you cannot understand Christianity or the first century Jewish matrix out of it group without reading the book of Isaiah. Like, you just cannot. You can't understand the person of Jesus and the way he's interpreted in the New Testament without understanding the book of Isaiah. I mean, think about, like, Luke 4, right? This famous story about Luke of Jesus going to his home synagogue. He picks up the book of Isaiah and he starts reading from 3rd Isaiah, right? It's from chapter 61. If that is an historical story, we have to ask the New Testament people, but, like, Jesus understood himself in terms of the book of Isaiah. Like, he interpreted his own life and calling from this book. And so that's interesting, right? And there's a reason why historically some people have referred to Isaiah as the 5th gospel. It functions that way, I would say. Like, just think about Advent and how many Isaiah texts there are. Think about Christmas in the liturgy and how many Isaiah. Think about Handel's Messiah and how much of Isaiah is present there. And I just think this is one of the most important and interesting and weird books that we have to just sort of get to know and come to terms with.
So you mentioned texts in Advent and Lent and Handel's Messiah. Maybe talk about one or two of those texts.
Yeah, right. So I got to think back to the Advent text. Well, let me start with the voice from the wilderness text. Yeah, that's in chapter 40. And so, a voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. And this, of course, gets picked up by like John the Baptist gets interpreted through this kind of a text as well. It echoes profoundly the earlier wilderness narratives from the Pentateuch, I would say. And so it's a text that is written to a people who like the wilderness, probably feel desolate, like it's a place where there is no life, like it's a place where they are stuck and can't get out. But for Isaiah, the dry desert is actually the place where new and creative growth happens. And so it's a text of hope in the face of hopelessness. It's a text of hope growing out of longing and out of suffering and out of pain. While those emerge out of a very particular experience in Judah's history, I think there are also universal things there about what it's like to suffer and to lose and to find new footing in the wake of loss.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I wonder if you could say just a word about the suffering servant song, as we call it, in Isaiah 52 and 53.
Yeah, this is such an interesting text and so crucial, right? So 52:13 through 53:12, this is often what's called the suffering servant, and it's rightly called that. I don't have any problem with naming it that. It's it's fascinating for a couple of reasons. One, it's fascinating because like when Christians read that, we're like, wow, Christians are like, oh my gosh, like this feels so much like what we see in the life of Jesus suffering. Certainly the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts was reading this text and then needed a little bit of help, I think, from Philip, right? To sort of connect the dots and say, oh yeah, like this is the same guy. But I would also say it's one of the weirder texts in Isaiah, one of the stranger texts. For this reason, is a text about restoration. It's a text about hope and all of those things. But like all those things come out of the suffering of this one person. And we don't know who it is. Like historically, is this the prophet? Is this the people? The servant gets identified with all kinds of different things. So we don't know who it is. Maybe from my perspective, maybe it isn't a person. Maybe it's a mantle. Maybe it's a calling. Maybe it's like a role or a vocation that different people and different groups or whatever can step into at different times in history. Who knows? But it's interesting because like most of the restoration texts, like when you look at Isaiah, texts like Isaiah 11, Isaiah 60, 65 through 66, and they're talking about restoration, like so much of it is about Yahweh establishing power in the earth. Like the messianic figure in chapter 11, like kills the wicked. And like that's where justice comes from. That's not what this text is about. And that's part of what makes it stand out as strange. Yeah. Or that was such a rambling answer.
No, it's true. And we read this during Lent, right? Who has believed what we have heard? He grew up before him like a young plant. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of sorrow and acquainted with grief. It's, the early Christians, they read this and saw Jesus there.
Hard for them not to, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, kind of impossible.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And yet it's interesting that the text doesn't show up that much in the New Testament. That's what's so bizarre. Like it shows up in Acts, but it's like you'd think that if it were that much of a like turnkey text for people, like that it opened up the world, it really doesn't show up all that often.
Yeah, that is interesting.
At least as far as I can tell.
What's one key theme you'd want people to look for as they kind of enter the text? You said, you'd suggest they read it kind of cover to cover, slowly and with a guide. And what's something that you'd suggest that they kind of keep their eyes open for throughout?
We talked about the theme of judgment and kind of compassion and judgment, law, gospel, however you want to promise and demand, whatever you want to use. I think that dual theme shows up really, really remarkably. Luther, of course, picked up on this in so many profound ways. But just watch for how they play off of each other. Watch for that dynamic because it is there in just about every chapter or section.
All right. So our last question is describe the book of Isaiah in 7 words or less.
Oh, gosh. I remember working on this. I think I said something like Isaiah is the most consequential book in the Old Testament. And that's not really its content. I'm thinking more about its impact. But I wanted to just sort of come out strong and say, like, this really is one of the most consequential books from the Old Testament that we can read to this day. Not just for early Christians, but to this day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and like you've been saying in this whole episode, you can't understand Christian theology and Jesus' own self-understanding without reading the book of Isaiah. So I think you're certainly right that it is vital for Christian life and faith.
And maybe I'll just add one other thing. And Kathryn, I want to kind of invite you into this too. Like the book of Isaiah is mostly poetry, and Hebrew poetry is hard. So like if you're going to get into this book, like take it very, very slowly. Like the way I like to talk about it is that reading Hebrew poetry, you can't think about it as fast food. Like this is a sit down restaurant experience. You're not eating McDonald's, people. And if you're trying to eat it like McDonald's, then your stomach's going to get upset. And you're just going to like glaze over. Like you need to be patient with the text and patient with yourself and recognize that these are really hard. If you can read them, if you're reading them slowly, awesome. That's probably where you're going to get the best bang for your buck.
No, I think that's exactly right. And it's a good analogy.
Yeah. I love it. All right. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for being with us. This has been the Bible in a Year podcast from Enter the Bible. And check out more great resources on the Bible at enterthebible.org. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast app or watching on YouTube, we are so grateful that you're here with us. You can get more great resources like this, conversations, reflections, commentaries, courses, anything that you could need as you dive in and enter the Bible with curiosity and faith. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review or like and subscribe. Of course, the very best compliment you can pay us is to share this podcast with a friend. Until next time.